Okay, so this is going to be a step-by-step tutorial on how to actually take our assets that we've made and implement them in. Now that we've gotten the brief overview of FMOD out and how it works, let's get into the details step by step. So we're going to start with implementing our loops. You're going to go over to your events tab right here. We're going to right click, go to event defaults, and select 3D timeline. This is going to pull up our DAW style timeline, right? And we're going to name this event whatever ambience, right? So I did Genshin Impact, so we'll just call this Genshin Ambience, right? Next, what we're going to do is going to go ahead and file, save as, like right away we're going to do this. So I'm going to save mine to my desktop. We're going to use our naming convention that we use for everything. So AAMP underscore your initials underscore project 1 FMOD session. Okay, you can name it whatever, just so long as it's something like that. So this is going to create your FMOD session folder. So we'll hit save and keep track of that because we're going to have to go to it a couple times. Now that we have that made, go ahead and select our event. And everything will be there. Okay, step 2, we're going to add our assets to the folder, right? So we're going to go to the assets tab over here, and then we're going to grab our folders that we made inside of Pro Tools and exported out already, right? So I'm going to take mine. I have them organized in loops and random, right? I'm just going to take both of them, drag and drop these folders into assets, right? When I do that, it is going to immediately create an assets folder in our current session that has loops and random SFX. So it actually maintained my file structure perfectly, which is what we want. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to right click over here, add audio track. Okay, right? So we've got 2 now. We want as many audio tracks as we do ambient loops for now, right? Because we're going to start by implementing the ambient loops and then the random sounds next. So I've got 4. I know it says 5, but that's for later. So I'm going to add 4 audio tracks total, right? You do that by right-clicking, add audio track. Next, we're going to add single instrument to all of these tracks. Like we discussed in the last tutorial video, a single instrument will basically just play whatever sound we tell it to in the way that we tell it to with the parameters, right? We're going to open a single instrument on all of these. There's going to be 1 for each of our ambient loops. And then we're going to drag and drop the start and end of these files to be exactly 1 minute long, because we know that's how long our ambient loops are from the session. To avoid having to go back and forth like this all the time, you go down to this kind of timeline overview and just hit zoom to fit. It'll fit everything there. But yeah, so now we're going to do this to all of our single instrument tracks. We want them all to be 1 second long. All right. Woohoo, make them all long. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to select the instrument itself. Don't select the audio track, because you'll see here that pulls up your master fader or your audio track fader. You want to click on the actual instrument itself, which is this big empty container. And then you'll see down here what that instrument looks like, right? We've got a volume, we've got pitch, we've got start offset, asynchronous playback, loops, and number of times played. So you don't need to know about that mostly. But what we are going to do is take our first ambient loop and drop it directly into this drag audio file here portion. And you'll see when I did that, that the waveform appeared in both this little region and over here on the region on our timeline, right? So let's do that for everything. Take our second loop, drop it in. Take our third loop, drop it in. Take our fourth loop and drop it in. Right, so now you can see these are all full of folders and files, correct? Now we've got all of them in, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to play them back and kind of like mix the volume levels very roughly a little bit. So let's go ahead and play that. You'll see over here on each audio track there's a volume knob. Just turn it to what feels right. Okay. I feel like that sounds pretty good, right? So the next thing that we're going to do is create our loop. So remember how I discussed in our last video that there's this little thing here called logic tracks, right? It's this little black bar above the timeline. That's going to affect how the playhead is used, right? So you can use markers, you can use loops, you can use these other things, whatever. We're really only concerned about the loop region. So you're going to go to this little black bar right here. You're going to right click, add loop region, and it's just going to show up with this little blue box, right? We're going to drag the start and end of that blue box to fit exactly around our audio files. And so now if you hit play on the timeline, it should loop this whole segment. So I'll start at like 56 seconds and see where it goes from here. Hit play. And as you see, it started back over. And if you made your loops correctly inside of Pro Tools, when it goes back to the top of it, to the front of it, right, you're not going to hear any sort of pops or clicks. If you do hear pops and clicks, you need to go back to Pro Tools and clean up your loop to make sure that it's perfect again. So next we're going to be doing our random sound effects. So these are going to be a little bit different. I mentioned during the tutorial earlier that we're going to be using both single instruments and something called scatterer instruments. Our random sounds are going to be using these scatterer instruments. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another audio track. So right click the audio number, audio track number over here. Click add audio track. And then right click the timeline. And instead of hitting add single instrument, we're going to go down here to add scatterer instrument, right? We're going to drag this out like we did so that it fits our whole timeline. Now, if you look down here, the scatterer instrument is pretty different. There's all these different knobs and everything, right? We'll talk about those in a sec, but what you want to think of them as is like, if you have a cluster of similar random sound effects, you want them all to go in the same scatterer instrument, right? So like if I have like 4 wind gusts, right? I want them all in one scatterer instrument. I've got 5 seagulls. I want them all in one scatterer instrument. I've got 5 random birds. They'll all go together in one scatterer instrument. So we'll start with, I'll do this with seagulls because it's probably the most obvious. So I'm going to grab all of my seagulls audio files, just grab one and then hold shift and then hit the bottom one and that'll select all 5, right? And I'm going to drag and drop them down here into this playlist right here, right? So instead of having on our single instrument, we have just this one thing with the waveform, this one container. With the scatterer instrument, we have something called a playlist, and it's got all of our audio files in there. And if you want, you can click on them and individually tweak them like they're a single instrument, right? We're not going to do that though. So once these are in, let's hear what they sound like. You can kind of see it's playing a bunch of them all at once, right? All at different random intervals, which is pretty cool, to be honest. It's a really good way to get a lot of random things. However, we have to control this because right now we have like 1,000 seagulls making noises all at once, and that's way too many. So we've got all these knobs over here to tweak that. You've got, of course, the master volume for this instrument. You've got the spawn rate, which is how often these audio files are triggered by different playheads. You've got spawn total, which controls the full number of times that spawns are created per time you hit play, right? So to better make a better example of this, right? If I set this number to 1, it's only going to play one random file one time. Ready? And it's out. And it's never going to play anything ever again, right? Until you hit play again. So we're going to take the spawn total and turn it to infinity because we want this thing to be endlessly generating random seagulls forever, because who knows how long the player will be standing in that spot listening to that ambient loop. Next is going to be this volume rand, or volume RND, whatever. It's a randomizer of the volume, right? So when it calls an audio file from your playlist of 5, right, it'll randomize the volume by whatever you specify. So we're going to put it with -3. So between -3 and whatever the full volume is of the audio file, it's going to call it somewhere in between that, right? And if you want, you can go really crazy with it and make one of them like you can make your range -38 all the way to 0, right? Which is huge and borderline unusable. But so we're just going to be doing it. For my birds, I'm putting them at like -3.5, -4, whatever. Next is going to be pitch RND. So this is pitch random. It's going to randomize the pitch of the audio file played within whatever you specify. So like if I set it to 4, that means it's going to be within 4 semitones, right? And that can be 4 up or 4 down. And then lastly, we have a knob for polyphony, which is something you'll run into in synthesizers a lot. It's basically just how many spawns or notes can be playing all at one time, right? So I want ours to be set to, for this specific example, like 2, maybe 3. You'll definitely want to play with it and see what works best for you, right? So now if we play it back, you'll hear that only maximum 3 things can be playing at a time. Cool, right? Next we're going to be doing the spawn intervals. So you saw how they're all kind of playing at random. Sometimes it's like almost right away another one starts, and sometimes it's like pretty far away, right? So we're going to set a range that these spawns can start, right? So down here there's this little slider ribbon. It can go anywhere from like 10 milliseconds, it'll call a new one, all the way up until 300 seconds, so very rarely. So we're going to drag and move these around until what feels right, right? So like the minimum amount of time I want to pass between seagulls being called is 1.5 seconds. But like the maximum, I only want like maybe 10 seconds of silence. So we're just randomizing the silence between triggers of these audio files, right? So by setting this to 1.5 and 9.5, if we hit play, they may be a little bit more spaced out, and sometimes they'll finish, and hopefully another one comes around in a second. Yeah, there it is, right? So that helps. Maybe these are a little bit too far apart, so maybe we move it to 1.5 seconds to 5.5 seconds, right? We have one. There's a second one, yeah. There's a third. Another one plays. But you hear how we can increase this, maybe 7 seconds feels right, whatever. Doesn't matter. Next is going to be your minimum scattered distance. So this is going to be the variable that tells us where it is in space, right? In 3D space. So that might be randomizing it. The low numbers pretty close, right, to the player. And then these bigger numbers are going to be far, far away. And it'll randomize, left and right, whatever. Because we're imagining the point that this is emitting from is like right in front of our face. So we're going to set this to maybe like 5, maybe like 6.5, all the way to like 300. I don't know. It's a pretty wide range, but let's see what it sounds like. These are happening pretty infrequently, but you can see sometimes multiple are playing, sometimes they're louder, sometimes they're quieter. And maybe if they're too quiet, that's because they're too far away. So we change it from like the maximum distance from like 300 to like 70, Hit play again. So now maybe they'll be a little bit more closer because they're not they can't randomly spawn super far away. Okay? So basically, once you've done this once, we're going to do it for every sort of cluster, right? So if we create another audio track, because I know where this stuff is. Oh, the other thing I'll mention really quickly. If you forgot to add one of your files like I did just now, you can just grab it and drag it down to the playlist and it'll throw it in, right? So, okay, so we've got our two other groups. We're going to have another scatterer instrument. We're going to drag it all the way out. Another scatterer instrument, and we're going to drag it all the way out. And for the first, the second empty one, right, we're going to click on the actual instrument itself, not the audio track, but the instrument. I'm going to grab this cluster of sounds. These are all going to be forest day birds, right? I'm going to drop them all in, and you'll see they populate, right? We're going to randomize the spawn rate, keep it at 100% because we want it to always be doing a spawn. We want the spawn total to always be infinity because it's going to be a never-ending ambient loop, right? We're going to do a volume randomness of whatever feels right. I think based on doing this before, it's probably minus 3.5, but mess around with it. We're going to adjust the pitch randomness to be floating around a little bit. I'm going to make the polyphony 3 so we can only ever have 3 things playing at the same time. I'm going to make this spawn interval anywhere from 700 milliseconds to 7 seconds. And then I'm going to adjust the farness away from about 4 to about 55. And then the other thing I know about this, because I was messing with it earlier, I think my bird sounds are all a little too high pitched. So if you want to turn down the master pitch of this cluster of things, there's a knob right here called pitch that you can just do that with. It won't be modulated, it won't be randomized, it will just be a full, everything starts at -2 in pitch instead of in the middle, right? So let's go ahead and hear that. I think I'm going to make the polyphony 4, and we're going to make them happen more frequently by adjusting the min and max spawn interval. Okay, they're happening too much now, so let's go back to changing the spawn interval somewhere in the middle. Awesome, okay. So then we're going to do the last thing we're going to do with wind gusts. So we'll select our last scatterer instrument, drop our wind gusts in. We're going to mess a little bit with the pitch, randomization and the volume randomization. I'm going to change the polyphony to 2 because I don't want more than 2 of these gusts happening at the same time. I also want them to be pretty spaced out and kind of far away. And let's hear what they sound like. Cool. Okay. So now when we play all of these together, you should have your finished ambience at this point, right? This is what it's going to sound like, and all you can do at this point is just mix it. So now that you're in it, you kind of listen to the background. This is when you want to start adjusting things. So I'm finding here that my birds are maybe playing a little too often. So I'm going to adjust their min-max spawn interval so that they can't happen so close together. And I'm going to make their polyphony 2 so that there can't be more than 2 birds at once, right? So otherwise, I think this sounds pretty close to augmenting now, but I'm very happy with this. Very happy with this. So what do we do at this point? So you can go click the audio track or something, right? And you can add effects to it if you want. So this I know is my seagull track. These are all dry. I didn't put any reverb on them, so I'm going to go down here to our audio track deck. I am going to click right here. It says right click to add post fader effects. You can just click on it, or you can right click, whatever. I'm going to add a reverb effect. set the reverb time to like 2.5 seconds. We'll make the low gain -6, just so there's not a lot of rumbly low end. Not that there would be anyway, because these are signal noises, but you get the point, right? So you can add reverb and things like this to this at this point. And we'll come up on a minute soon, but you'll see it'll loop, you know, and you won't hear that it's ever changing, or you won't hear that it's ever looping. It's always changing. The best part about this whole thing is that when you do give this to the programmer and say, hey, I updated the build, just make sure that Genshin Ambience gets called when the player is in this region, right? And this will just kind of happen forever. The programmer doesn't have to know what you're doing. It's really all in your control. It's kind of the perfect tool for interfacing between the sound designer and the programmer, and also the sound designer and the player, right? So at this point, we're just going to do a couple like housekeeping things. So like overall, if I click on this, so deselect so that there's no selected ambient track, I can kind of see my master where everything is at, right? Everything's pretty good. I might turn things up a little bit. It doesn't have to be super loud, doesn't have to be super quiet. I just don't want any clipping or anything, right? But anyhow, yeah, so once you've done this at this point, the game is makes you feeling like sick. I have a great ambience. All you have to do is go through and like, we're just gonna rename some stuff. So like I'm gonna rename everything to what it is so it makes sense, right? So this is gonna be called, the first loop is of Sandy Wind, so I'm gonna call it Sandy Wind. And then we're gonna name these as well. So you wanna name these groups as like, this is the seagulls, right? So obviously your project will be different. You'll have different loops. You will have different randoms, but overall it should kind of look like this. If you do separate ambient loops, you'll have multiple. Some of you could choose to just do one bounced loop if you feel like it. And then just have one scatter instrument per group. At this point, just save your project, quit, and then I'm going to open up my project over here. We'll take a look at it. You can see there's my FMOD project, the assets, the metadata associated with it. This is actually what the programmer looks at, right? And what the game engine looks at. So this is just like a spaghetti nightmare that I don't want to look at. All I care is that all the assets are there, right? And that the FMOD sessions opens up to do what we want. So at this point, you can compress it, and then just go drop it right over in Canvas. And that's it. That's how you turn in Project 1. So that's everything you need to know. Yeah, have a good day. Bye-bye.